Congratulations on completing a tremendous week of science. And luckily we get sort of a cherry on top or a grand finale with Paul's talk and the cocktail mixer afterwards. I'm really happy to introduce Paul. I've been a big fan of his for a long time. He's definitely a role model in science for me. Many of you know, but Paul's a Canadian research chair at the University of Quebec at Montreal. And in that chair research, he and his team seek to expand our understanding of carbon biogeochemistry in boreal lakes and rivers. And to me, the opinions of scientist trainees speak volumes about the quality of that scientist, and so I polled some of Paul's current and former trainees to get their opinions about him. And I got tremendous feedback, and it was all very similar. There were sort of two key take-home points they had about Paul. They described how he works tirelessly to maintain a very enthusiastic and positive environment in their group. So, for example, one student, I'll quote him, said, when Paul asks you how you are doing in the morning, he truly means it. He wants to get an answer from him, the students on that, and make sure that they're doing well as people and not just scientists. Another thing that was a theme is that he thinks outside of the box and asks very simple but deep and probing questions. And I agree, I think I've been subject to some of those questions in the past. But they're always very constructive and helpful. So I'll give you one little story about that. Apparently at UChem they had a departmental speaker visiting. They had given a great talk about cross-ecosystem subsidies, both terrestrial to aquatic and aquatic to terrestrial. And at the end of the talk, Paul raised his hand and asked the question, what about frogs? And apparently the crowd laughed just like you all just laughed. But if you think about it for a second, it's a really deep question. He's asking, you have this framework, how does an amphibian that sort of uses both those systems at different stages of their life, how does that fit into that mental model that speaker has? So I think that speaks volumes about Paul as a scientist. And so we're all lucky enough to hear Paul talk about carbon.
Well, I know as much of B as B knows of me. Thank you, Stuart, for that really nice introduction, and thank you all for being here. I want to repeat the thanks to our organizers. I think we've had an excellent meeting. At least I've enjoyed it a lot. It has been smaller, but very, very pleasant, I think so. And so thank you all for that. I also want to thank and congratulate our students and our junior faculty for the really outstanding. I'm going to stand somewhere where I'm not blinded. Perhaps here? No. Yeah. Really outstanding talks and posters that we have seen in this conference. This is really good for me and I guess for all of us to see what our incoming generation is capable of doing. So congratulations to all of you for that. When I was invited to give this plenary on Friday, I imagined that we would all be very tired, and I think we are all very tired. So I thought to myself, I'm going to try to keep this light, and I'm going to try to, rather than introduce a lot of new stuff, perhaps I would do a little bit of a wrap-up of what we have seen during the meeting. So I have actually made this talk during the meeting while we were here, trying to get pieces of things related to carbon. I changed the title slightly to what it was in the original thing. Now it's called Too Much Carbon, because after a week, my God, it gets... it does get a bit too much carbon. But so what I'm going to be doing, and I wanted to do this mostly for the non-carbonaceous colleagues, so that they can share with us some of the developments that we saw here in this meeting related to carbon. So I apologize to my carbocentric colleagues, because this will be repetitive for you, and there will be not much of novelty for any of you. Thank you for those who shared slides with me. To prepare this talk. I have enough PowerPoints in my computer to last me for the entire career. So if you see your results in future ASLO and so on, don't be surprised. because, you know, I might get some of them wrong, and anyway. So I think we should start at the beginning, and at the beginning there was the pipe. And that was a time of innocence. It was a time of joy. It was a time of freedom, because we didn't have to care about this carbon that escaped from land and reached the ocean. This was the oceanographer's problem, right? But then came the reactor. And this was the end of innocence, and the beginning of a very troubling period where we have been condemned forever to trying to fill in these arrows. And a lot of what we have been seeing in this meeting has a lot to do with filling the various arrows of this reactor that we have. Well, we have seen a lot of stuff, so I'm going to just do a little summary of the different pieces that we've seen along the meeting. And I will start here, paraphrasing a very interesting title of one of the carbon talks. So where does the carbon come from? And of course, the carbon comes from land. And this is the entry point of almost all the carbon that we see in our aquatic networks. And we have seen quite a few very interesting talks about where the carbon comes and how it travels and so on, and patterns in the delivery of carbon from soil, from land to water. One theme that is recurrent in this meeting and recurrent in the literature, contemporary literature, is the issue of browning. We have a lot of DOC coming from watersheds to water. We know that. This has been quantified for many years, but there is apparently a trend of increasing color and sometimes, not always, of DOC in these waters, and this has been termed browning, the browning of inland waters. And Emma gave us a really interesting talk about some hypotheses that could explain this browning, which has also been observed in North America. And it's also, we had an interesting talk about reservoirs, because this is also not just a biogeochemical problem. This is a problem that has practical implications, because too much DOC in your waters has implications about water treatment and so on. So this is a major issue in every sense. It's happening across continents, but sometimes it happens even in the same region. Here's Wisconsin. Sometimes it doesn't. So this is clearly a very complex issue, and there were lots of talks about the pattern and some of the underlying mechanisms of this pattern. It's not just how much carbon gets from land to the ocean, but also to inland waters, but also what type of carbon is there. And we had talks about what changes the nature of the carbon that escapes soils and reaches inland waters. For example, this very interesting talk as well that looked at how position along this gradient of slope and watershed position influences the nature of the carbon that is delivered from soils in terms of their isotopic and C14 and C13 signatures. And there are very big changes, including also changes related to rain events. And so it's not always the same carbon that is being delivered from soil to inland waters. And that has a major implication on what happens to this carbon after. I couldn't resist. How do we turn this on? I need somebody to help me. Because I don't have a computer. This is an animation. Is there somebody in the back? Hello? Can we turn this animation on? There you go. Joel Rowland presented to us talking about how do rivers charge in particulate and inorganic carbon. Where does this carbon come from? Well, look at this. Look at the life of this river and how it changes over not so many years. And this erosion and so on is what generates these particular loads that then eventually get into the ocean. I found this absolutely marvelous. Thank you. So these are interesting talks about carbon delivery from land to inland waters. Now, what happens then? And at the other end of the pipe is the ocean. And the oceanographers should care about this, but, well, we can care a little bit as well. And we had some talks about carbon reaching the ocean. And I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but Yves, my colleague from the UQAM, Yves Perry, presented this meta-analysis, this revised global river export budget based on a new meta-analysis of recent carbon export data. And this is a very large-scale study because it covers a very large proportion of the Earth's watersheds in terms of data, in terms of having data, actual measures. And one of the interesting conclusions about this is that these are the previous well-established numbers that we have from the previous similar type of study. The numbers are not that different in terms of, slightly different, certainly different for POC, but in terms of DOC and DIC, the numbers haven't changed very much. That global budget is a little bit lower than what we thought before. I think it's a more realistic number. But what is interesting is that browning that we just mentioned, in other words, that increase in delivery is not showing up in the oceans, at least yet. So something is happening to this carbon in the way, because it's still not showing up as delivery to the ocean. Another interesting point that Yves brought up is that through this analysis, it has become evident that land use change has actually played a big role in the current delivery of carbon, both DOC, DIC, and also particulate carbon, to the oceans. And Yves estimates through the study that our current, anywhere from 30 to 50% of our current export to the oceans could actually be directly due to agriculture, to changes in land use due to agriculture, relative to what it used to be before in pre-agricultural time. So this is a human signature footprint on the carbon that's arriving from land to the ocean. I thought that was interesting. The middle of this, the heart of this, is a reactor. And this is where this carbon that exits land is processed. Martin Berggren gave us an excellent, I don't know why you laugh. Martin Berggren gave us an excellent tutorial about this, and he made the point of the complexity of the pathways involved in this reactor function of this network. Right? I'm going to walk you through each one of these arrows so that we can understand this at depth. No, I'm not going to do that. But keep this image of complexity. I'm just going to simplify that a bit. And one of we are talking about transformation of terrestrial carbon as it circulates in inland waters. And we saw a lot of what we saw here in the meeting had to do with either the relative role of light, in other words, photochemical processes, and biological degradation in the transformation and degradation of this organic matter. So we had quite a few talks looking at this relative balance. We had interesting, of course I'm drawing examples, we had a lot more than this, but one common theme in everything that we saw is, of course, this is very variable, depending on where you are in what type of ecosystem, where you stand along, for instance, this gradient that goes from headwaters to the ocean. Well, the relative proportion of these different processes tends to vary, and this is not surprising, but this is becoming a theme in our discipline, this idea that things need to be looked at along the network, along the continuum, and this is something I'm going to come to later on. So these processes vary. This is in the Arctic, where photochemistry seems to play a major role, but in other systems, it's biology that is responsible for the largest proportion of the degradation or transformation of this organic matter. But what is emerging as well is, again, this notion that the carbon is circulating, and the carbon that we see in a specific river or in a specific lake is actually the result of some kind of continuum. In his case, this is residence time of that carbon in the network. This is the amount of DOC or CDOM that was originally delivered. So ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, kind of set themselves along this two or three dimension. It's a continuous process. And other studies, in this case by Dominique Bachon, touched upon the same issue, but from a biological point of view, and made the point that this terrestrial carbon is continuously being entered into lakes and so on. And within a given lake, you have a whole range of carbon ages, if you wish. Carbon that just got loaded and carbon that perhaps has spent a year in the lake. So that determines the average reactivity of this carbon. Well, you could make the same analogy. This could be a lake in the landscape. So lakes in different positions of the landscape that has had previous history could have different reactivity simply because of a historical perspective that has to do with water residence time. So water residence time emerges as perhaps a fundamental unifying factor that is underlying all the processing of carbon in these aquatic networks. And this leads us, Dolly made a very interesting point about, well, we have to review even our concept of what is recalcitrance and reactivity, because everything is relative to where you stand along this continuum of time and exposure. And what is interesting is that we are beginning to have better tools to follow that. We have fluorescence and we have other things, but now we have a new generation of things that we can use to trace how this carbon is changing, and we can do the molecular fingerprint of this DOM, and this is almost like a genetic fingerprint. It's the equivalent of genomics in terms of DOC, which is really interesting. So that we can actually explore how this fingerprint is varying along the continuum. Biological transformation varies across landscapes and also within a given network as a function of network position. So it's never the question whether photochemistry or biology are the things. That's a non-question. The question is, where are they most relevant? In what portion of the landscape are they most relevant? Hydrology plays a major role, and residence time, now not just residence time in your own ecosystem, but in the network, plays a key role in all of this. And this, of course, transcends individual ecosystems. And this is a very important aspect of perhaps the message that I want to come back to at the end, that all of this that we're seeing these are network properties, and we have to slowly get away from the notion of looking at our own individual system and looking at this network, these emerging network properties. This is where the thing is happening. A lot of this processing of carbon generates gas, and this is the outflux that we see in so many lakes. This is a major issue because we have a lot of CO2 fluxing out of lakes, and a major question, which has been also a major theme in our meeting here, but it's a major theme in our discipline, is, well, is this carbon that we see exiting here, is this soil respiration that's just injected into these aquatic systems, or is it actually generated inside lakes and rivers? This is the difference between an aquatic ecosystem acting as a vent or acting as a reactor. We had quite a few studies looking at this from different perspectives, because this seems an easy question to answer, but it is not at all, because you have to retracing the origin of this CO2 into the processes and pathways is not an easy thing at all. We have seen various approaches, some of them isotopic, because we can benefit from isotopes to actually try to distinguish these pathways and so on. We have seen some really interesting work on this. Others have taken another approach is to say, well, let's look at metabolism. Let's see what metabolism generates, and the rest must be something else, right? So Ed Steads introduced us to this idea. You can follow metabolism, and one way to to reconstruct this is to see, well, if all of the CO2 originates from metabolism in the lake, well, there has to be a close coupling between the dynamics of oxygen and the dynamics of CO2. They are the two faces of the same coin, right? So there were several studies about this. Ed showed for a number of rivers or lakes, I forget. Well, Ed is not here. No. Anyway, this is the same graph. This is departure of oxygen from equilibrium, and this is departure of CO2 from equilibrium. You can see it that way. And everybody, if everything is purely metabolic, all the points should follow roughly this diagonal here. And you can see that there is quite a mess around roughly follows, but there is a big mess. So, and the mess goes towards that side. There's a lot more CO2 than you would expect just based on metabolism. So this is telling you that, first of all, metabolism doesn't explain all of your CO2. You need additional sources. But the second thing is that the coupling between these two things is very, very loose. Well, we saw a very similar study from Grace and colleagues, Grace Wilkinson and colleagues, doing basically the same thing, but in an experimental setting where they manipulated lakes. And this is basically the same thing, although reversed, I guess. Yes. But notice that things kind of align along the diagonal with a lot of scatter. Again, you need a lot more CO2 than is generated by metabolism to explain your CO2 in the lakes. Matt Bogart took so we had this interesting confluence of several talks actually addressing the same problem in a roughly similar manner. Matt Bogart for boreal lakes showed the same thing. This is basically net, this is oxygen, if you wish, and this is CO2 flux, and this is the diagonal. Everything that is metabolic should follow this. You can see there's a lot of uncoupling. This requires a lot of external CO2. So from this, we can infer that in most of these lakes, you require a very strong external input of CO2. Some of it is groundwater, but it turns out that not all can be groundwater. So this is further suggesting that there must be anaerobic CO2 production in these systems that is adding CO2 without influencing too much the oxygen. So this is changing, in a way, the way that we are seeing these relationships. The other thing is that for a long time, we have assumed that oxygen and CO2 were strongly coupled in ecosystems. And we assumed that by measuring, you could use oxygen to reconstruct carbon dynamics. Well, this kind of plot would say, there's a problem with that. So this will make us think about how we approach these problems in the future as well. Ice is an issue where we come from, perhaps not here. And winter is long in many of our boreal landscapes, in northern landscapes. And we had an interesting talk about the influence of, or the role of under ice period in the annual budget. And you can see that if you only take the open water, this lake would function as a net sink of CO2. But if you incorporate the winter and do a whole year budget, where this lake acts as a net source of CO2. Well, this makes quite a difference. So we actually need to incorporate winter in these annual budgets. And the work in our own group across a number of lakes has concluded that winter under ice processes actually account for between 15 and 25% of the annual lake budget. So this is not a trivial number. The bottom line is that whether a system acts as a reactor or just as a vent depends greatly on where the ecosystem stands along this continuum of processing and connectivity to land and of time of residence. And we had a very interesting example from Joan-Père ici, where within the same network of rivers, and this is not a huge basin, you had portions of this network that acted as a reactor and other portions that acted as a pipe. So it is a known question to ask, are these ecosystems acting as a pipe or a vent or a reactor? The question is, where are these functions predominant along the network and in the landscape? Regardless of where the CO2 comes from, the question is, well, why does it matter? It matters from a biogeochemical point of view, but it matters also from a budgeting point of view, because I just put some here. These are just very broad numbers, just to place in context. In our northern landscapes, this is more or less a range of gross primary production. Of course, net primary production is a lot lower than that. Fire emissions are very important in the boreal, and they are incorporated into terrestrial carbon budgets. They have been for a long time. Soil carbon accumulation is very important because in the end, all of this happens, but this is the real net storage of carbon in the landscape. It's not the tree, it's the soil. A net ecosystem exchange in these landscapes, although you can have a fair amount of gross primary production, can be positive, so this is a sink of carbon, but some portions of these terrestrial landscapes actually act as a source as well. It depends on the year and many things. Well, this is just a range of aquatic CO2 emissions per unit of land, if you just scale to per unit. And I just put this to convey the notion that this is a small number relative to that, but this is a very large number relative to that. If you include, and these things are never, seldom, if never included in any of these budgets that we see for the terrestrial component of the landscape. Right? So I just want to make the point that if you were to include these aquatic emissions, not only do you change the magnitude of this, but you can even reverse the sign of what the landscape is doing. So this is why we care, and part of what we are doing as a community is offer our terrestrial colleagues the tools for them to incorporate this, because this is still not completely in the radar of our global modelers, of our terrestrial colleagues, and so on. So this is our responsibility, to provide clear tools and ways for them to incorporate this portion of the landscape that they have yet not incorporated. There's something missing. Methane, big deal. We had very interesting methane talks, and methane, of course, has been present for a long time, but it is, I would call it, an emerging issue in the sense that there's a renewed realization of how important methane actually is. Beyond it being a biogeochemical curiosity and so on, it is actually of major global importance in terms of what freshwaters are doing. Tonya, I borrowed this from Tonya just to remind you that methane is very complex, and no wonder we are having surprises all the time, because it has so many components, and so it's made somewhere, we think it's made somewhere here, but it can diffuse, it gets oxidized, it can bubble, it can be transferred through plants. So this is complex, and we've seen talks, really interesting talks, targeting different aspects of the processes and the mechanisms underlying these. But sometimes one has to ask relatively simple questions, and one of them is, well, we've grown used to seeing methane everywhere. We go to any lake, and all the lakes are supersaturated. And of course, when you go to a small lake, it's not surprising, because you see the shore there, and you see the sediments, and you see, the methane could be there. But what happens when you go to one of these very big and very deep lakes, where the center point is really far from the shore and really far from the sediment? Why is there methane always in these lakes? The same can be said for the ocean, and that's a different, which is true also for the ocean, but that's a different story, or partly different story. So Tonya Del Sonto, who's actually working with us, with Eve at the UQAM, has been working on trying to model the spatial distribution of methane across lakes to try to understand, why is it that we see methane everywhere, and at what conditions do we see methane, and what are the physical and biological factors that influence this distribution of methane that we see everywhere. Seems like a simple question, why is there methane in the middle of big lakes, but it is not in any way. And we have learned that physics, of course, plays a major role in this, but there are other things as well. What complicates everything is that we see new things emerging, new pathways and so on. And for instance, we have seen recently that the paradigm is that methane is made in the sediments that are anoxic and so on, and then it moves around the lake and it reaches the surface and all the rest. But it seems that now there's evidence, some of it coming from our own group and from other groups as well, that you can have methane production in the oxic water column through pathways that are still not entirely clear, through rates that are perhaps not the greatest, but nevertheless could be quite significant. So now we have to consider this as well, where we're trying to understand what generates the methane that is outfluxing from these ecosystems. Dan McGuinness gave us a really, really excellent overview, which I think many of us enjoyed a lot. Thank you very much. And he used this lake as an example where they have measured many of these components, many of these pieces of the methane puzzle. And The rates are very, I don't want to talk so much about the rates, but for instance, to me this was a complete and incredible surprise that this lake has a lot of cryoboros, like many lakes. Well, Dan estimates that a very significant component of the total flux of methane is actually mediated by cryoboros picking up methane in the bottom and pushing it and delivering it to the surface water. Well, to me this is wonderful because it adds another pathway that delivers methane that before we didn't, at least I didn't know. So I think we have a lot of things to discover with this, and I think it's really, really exciting. We have seen also a number of talks that have to do with the regulation of methane, but I just want to point one, which I think is interesting, that Stuart's group is working on, is the fact that, well, there is a relationship, and others in the meeting have actually pointed this out, that, of course, there is a relationship between lake productivity or ecosystem productivity and the amount of methane production. This probably has to do with the fact that when you have a lot of algae and a lot of primary production, well, you create the conditions that generate methane, organic matter and NOx in the bottom and so forth. So you tend to see this thing. What is interesting, at least for me in the context of this, is that, of course, this represents kind of an offset because, as we know, when lakes eutrophy and they become very productive, well, they tend to become sinks, net sinks of CO2. Rather than being net sources like most lakes, the most eutrophic lakes, the ones that are greener, well, become net sinks of CO2. Such is the degree of primary production. What is interesting is that these are the lakes that are also outfluxing the most methane. So they are becoming sinks of CO2, but they are becoming big sources of methane. And there is an interesting offset in terms of greenhouse gas balance between these two processes. And these are the things that we need to take in consideration when we are projecting future scenarios of change in terms of the direction of these processes. We've seen some stuff on temperature, but I just want to remind you that methane, everything that has to do with methane, is a lot more temperature dependent than almost anything else in the ecosystem. So you have Q10s for respiration, for nitrification, things like that, but the Q10s of methanogenesis, for example, are generally much higher than anything else. So any degree change in the water or in the sediment temperature will have a lot more effect on methane than any of the other processes, biological processes, in the same ecosystem. So that's a thing to bear in mind as well. Because I think this is true for now. The more we look for it, the more we find of it. And this is because we have looked for methane where we knew that we would find methane. So peat bog, wetlands, there are many decades of study of methane in these ecosystems. But for instance, small streams, rivers, these were never considered potentially as relevant sources of methane. And now we know there are, but this is relatively recent. So there's a lot of effort looking at these types of, and other types, even lakes, big lakes that we thought, well, they shouldn't have a lot of methane. Well, they do. So our estimates will continue to increase just because we are becoming more aware of methane and we are measuring it in places where before we didn't. And I think this is I predict, and I don't know if my methane colleagues would agree in the room, that our estimates of global methane emissions from fresh waters are likely to continue to increase over the next decade as we explore these things and as we capture more also the complexity of methane, the ebullition, etc. But methane fluxes themselves are likely to increase as well because the combination of land use change, temperature increases, and so on, all lead, for the most part, I would say all lead to the potential for increased methane production and emission from these ecosystems. So that's also an interesting thing. This is important because this is the global methane line, and this type of budget tries to partition this increase that we see globally in the atmospheric methane into this. Note, you cannot read it from the back, but here are the sources that we think are contributing to it. Wetlands are here, but freshwaters are absolutely absent in all of this. And when you look at the table of sources, freshwaters are here, and I just wanted to zoom them in because these are how freshwaters are included in the current global estimate of methane, and this taken from a couple of papers of people who, some of them are actually in this room, so I congratulate them for that. But it's a very, very, very small basis for including freshwaters in this global estimate. And this number, as we improve our estimates, is going to change a lot. And it is changing already, and we had a very interesting, we had several very interesting reservoir talks. Of course, reservoirs invoke methane because they create conditions for methane emissions, particularly in subtropical and tropical areas. And Bridget Deemer and colleagues have done a meta-analysis of reservoir methane emissions, published or perhaps even unpublished, and they have come up with a revised global budget for methane emissions from reservoirs, which is this pi, and these are the other major anthropogenic sources that are accounted for in the major budgets now. And now reservoirs become a piece of the pie of the same magnitude, of the same importance than the other pieces of the pie that we already know are important in terms of global methane. So this is the work that we as an aquatic community need to do in order to provide the tools to the greater scientific community to incorporate our ecosystems into this global budget. I just realized this is counting back. This is bad news for me. I thought I had plenty of time. Okay, I thought I would make a little parenthesis because I want to just mention to you our Mr. K. K is the gas exchange coefficient. It's the thing that regulates the speed at which the gases equilibrate in between water and atmosphere. This is purely physics. But we have to understand that every time we see a CO2, methane, or nitrous oxide, or oxygen flux of any kind, K is involved. Mr. K is involved somewhere there. And this is, we haven't had too much talk about K in this meeting, but I think it's very important to remind ourselves how important this little letter is. A letter, I think, that sometimes invokes other letters of the alphabet for people who have to deal with it. I can think of the F or the S. In the case of somebody who speaks Spanish like me, well, it would be more the M. But anyway, this gives us a lot of problem. It's measured with chambers, sometimes with eddy covariance, sometimes with other methods, isotopic methods. We do have some models of K. This one produced by Dominique Bachon and Yves for lakes as a function of wind speed and so on. But the point is that K is, as you can imagine, is highly variable because it's driven by physics, driven by turbulence, movement. So it varies in time within a given ecosystem, it varies across ecosystems. And it's actually, and this variability is not easily quantified or captured or modeled sometimes. We had a really interesting talk, and I think the only one that directly talked about K, in Tulik Lake, where they actually estimated K using an eddy covariance tower. And this is how K varies in this lake as a function of wind speed. And this study concluded that, well, this is a usual relationship with wind speed, but actually it doesn't behave as we would think it should under high speed and the high wind or low wind conditions, which is interesting. Now, knowing these things is particularly important because we need to use this case to get at gas fluxes. So we need to know this type of thing. But this is particularly difficult for rivers as well, because lakes vary their case with wind and during night and day. But rivers are also particularly difficult, and it's not difficult to imagine why. Now, this is a river where we are working up in the north, in the maritime boreal of Quebec. La Romaine is a beautiful river that now has been dammed, and we are working there. Of course, the river goes through stages like this, and you can see that the K here is going to be very, very different. This is the contour of the elevation contour of the lake. This is the St. Lawrence estuary here, and this is uphill. This is work that we are doing with Erin Hotchkiss in our group. And you can imagine that these places are rapid, well, things will happen. This is a reservoir that's built, that has been built into this, in this river only 2 years ago, and we have been studying this now for a couple of years, following this reservoir and following the river. This is what the CO2 looks like along this river. This is CO2 concentration along the river. Upstream, it varies a little bit. Then you hit the reservoir, and this is the outlet of the reservoir. Okay, so what this is saying is that, like all reservoirs, this reservoir is making a lot of CO2, and the outlet of the reservoir from the turbine is supercharged in CO2, and then it degasses downstream. And if we zoom on this downstream portion of the reservoir, this is the reservoir, this is down, there are some flat areas, there are some rapids, then flat areas, and this is what the CO2 looks like. It degasses, but of course it doesn't degas in the same way along these different places. And Erin has been calculating that these are the K values, this exchange coefficient. So in the flat areas, you tend to have low K values, but they increase enormously when you move into the rapids. This is not surprising. Now, the difficult thing here is how to incorporate this along the entire river. What do we do? Because we only need a little bit of rapids. This is an order of magnitude more exchange than here. So you only need a small amount of rapid in any of these rivers to completely change your global estimate of flux. So we are trying to capture this. Another interesting thing is, of course, the reservoir generates methane as well, and the water coming out of the reservoir is also supercharged in methane, which degasses downstream as well. Now, they are two subjected to the same physics of exchange, and yet when you do the calculations, the exchange, the Ks that you get are vastly different, always higher for methane. And this highlights another property which complicates even further our life, that although the physics of this is exactly the same, methane doesn't behave like the other gases when it comes to exchange. And this is another complication that we need to take into consideration when we are estimating fluxes from these ecosystems. Okay, sediment. We don't have, Dee promised to cut me when, no? When you feel it's done, we'll just finish. I obey B almost all the time in almost everything. Storage is the other component of this caricature, and we are interested in how much gets to the bottom, how much is stored there. We haven't had so many talks about storage in this meeting in particular. Perhaps I missed some, and I apologize if that's the case. Adam Heathcote presented us with a net budget for a number of lakes. This is kind of the summary, where he calculated the outflux of CO2, the input of DOC, the output, and also how much stays in the bottom buried. And this is kind of the net balance, which is an average for a number of boreal lakes that he studied. And the bottom line is that this carbon burial, this carbon storage in lakes, accounts for about, on average, 17% of the fluxes going out. So the first conclusion here is that these lakes, if you do the balance of these two things, are net sources of carbon to the atmosphere. Because this is much, you could be emitting CO2, but if this component were much, much greater, the lake as a whole would be a net sink, right? Which is not. So you can argue, well, it's a small storage is a small component. It's not, perhaps not that important. But it turns out that, and this doesn't apply to everywhere. It doesn't apply to New Mexico because there are not many lakes here. But in the boreal biome, where lakes can occupy from 5 to over 20% of the entire surface, when you extrapolate this amount of carbon that is stored in soils, well, it becomes a very large proportion of the whole land, the whole watershed carbon storage, and a very large proportion of what is stored in the adjacent soils. This is interesting because this carbon is, for the most part, is terrestrial carbon that escaped land and now found its way down to the bottom of lakes. And yet, it is not accounted for in any of the regional terrestrial carbon budgets that people are doing. So this is another reason why we collectively have to try to provide this kind of number and this kind of tool, because these things are not incorporated in most models and in most budgets, and therefore this represents a major gap in what we know about natural carbon sources and sinks in the landscape. By the way, Adam also has a recent paper that has shown that these rates of carbon burial have increased greatly in the recent decades, for reasons that we can only speculate, related perhaps to nitrogen deposition or other things. These are only hypotheses, but if anything, this function of lakes as carbon storage in the landscape is increasing recently. I decided to do like CNET and do a little pause, but I'm not going to dance for you. I'm not going to sing either. But I like the idea of having a pause. But we cannot linger anymore because I have still some ways to go. One emerging topic, I think, which is not any news to anybody, but it is, I think, it's re-emerging as a very key thing that we need to consider, are these little landscape, these little giants. The little giants are small ecosystems. Small streams, small ponds, small lakes, small bogs, because all the evidence suggests that these are extremely active ecosystems where there is a lot going on. So these are, we have seen various examples of this from Siberian rivers, from boreal peat ponds, small lakes. And this is, I think nobody would argue that we didn't know these, that these are hotspots of biogeochemical activity. But I think what we are realizing is that when you extrapolate their activity, they become major players in what's being done at the entire watershed scale. I was particularly intrigued by this. This is Nick Upton, who talked to us about carbon storage in small alpine rivers, in the small floodplains of alpine rivers. I had never thought of rivers as being sites of carbon storage. Well, they are sites, and also the fact that I love that he drew this thing himself. I would love to be able to draw my own slides like he did. So there's a lot of talent both ways involved in this. So small systems doing things that sometimes we, at least I didn't know, but also doing them at a very large scale. This is one of our heroes. And this is widespread in North America, but in Quebec we have a lot of beaver populations are increasing, like everywhere else, exponentially in North America. And they are creating a lot of habitat like this. And it doesn't take long to realize that this is prime time carbon biogeochemistry and methane and CO2 and you name it, because these are extremely active. There's sometimes so much organic matter and so on. So they create this type of thing more and more. Population growth in beaver represents exponential growth in beaver habitat. So beaver habitat is increasing, I forget at what rate per year, which is an amazing rate throughout North America. And just to give you an idea, because this is a little giant, but just to give you an idea that in some of our landscapes in the boreal, just compare, this is methane flux, this is diffusive methane flux. It doesn't even take account of bubbles, which would add probably double or 3 times this number. But just to give you an idea, this is the range of methane flux that we see in lakes, in the reservoir, which has very high methane fluxes. Some of these rivers, which is an order of magnitude in terms of how much they're fluxing out. If we added bubbles, it would be likely 2 orders of magnitude. So you only need a little bit of territory of beaver habitat to have a major impact on your regional fluxes of carbon, CO2, methane, and also likely N2O. Just to give you an idea, in this particular area of Quebec where we have high beaver density, beaver habitat accounts for about 1.5 of the total area. So there's more beaver habitat than actual stream area in this particular area, partly because beavers have impounded all of the streams. We have not found in this area in Abitibi a single stream below order 4 that is not impounded. So basically the entire network is now beaver habitat. Just to go over, you can see that the average fluxes for these, and the contribution to the total, what we estimate roughly what would be the total methane and CO2 flux. And you can see that a small amount of beaver habitat accounts for a very large percentage of the total aquatic. So these are truly biogeochemical giants, if you wish. So we need to take into consideration what they do. And they occupy not always, but often a small fraction of the landscape, but they contribute disproportionately. But they have been quite neglected. And I think we are revitalizing our perception of what the small streams, the small ponds, the small ditches, the role they play, because they do much of the biogeochemical work. I was going to say, it occurred to me this morning that there is an analogy with science and scientific communities, because sometimes some of the people in our community who do a lot of the work and who keep the scientific work going are not the ones who are most recognized. And some of them are somewhat neglected. So, you know, in science we also have research giants, which are not of, and there are many here in this room. The people who are not often given the most credit, but who are the ones making much of our advancement. I salute all the giants that are in this room. We need to do stuff with all of this, because this has to go somewhere. It's interesting to understand the mechanisms, which is super important, and the magnitudes and so on, but we are confronted with very major challenges, and these are challenges has to do, and I'm not saying anything that anybody here does not know, but we did have some talks about this. Today we had some really interesting talk about this, and in previous days as well, as to jumping from what we do in an individual system to what we do, how do we go from there to a watershed, and then this is Quebec, it doesn't show, but it's 1.5 million square kilometers with how many lakes, Eve? Well, 1.8 million lakes. We have sampled over the last 7 years with a big effort about 280 of them. So these are, and of course everybody has the same problem. And then we need this as well. And we have had some examples of upscaling. Ryan Hutchins showed us some efforts to predict, to develop tools for upscaling and prediction for carbon species in rivers, and using things that we can get, because it's useless to develop tools which function very well that take variables that we cannot get. So it has to be things that we can get with GIS, with remote sensing, and we had some examples of that in our meeting here. And in this case, well, the drivers, the things that relate to each one of these carbon species in rivers and boreal rivers, well, are not always the same. Sometimes you have similar things, and sometimes they have different predictors or drivers, if you wish. What is interesting about this is that, these, for instance, the models that Ryan presented have this regional intercept that set regions apart. It's almost like each region has its own baseline thing. And he showed us that these regional intercepts, well, are related to things like regional soil carbon, regional NEP, and so on. So this is interesting, because these are the things that eventually might help us, which I think is the case with Ryan, to not just extrapolate to one system at a time, but actually to extrapolate continuously in these networks. And this is a heat map of CO2 generated by Ryan, where you see the hotspots of CO2 and the low points of CO2 predicted from these upscaling. We need modeling as well, as Stuart Jones' group. Stuart talked about this today. He gave us a really interesting talk about this, about how to go around doing this. And what I find particularly important here is this need to combine hydrology with biogeochemistry, because they are intimate, and you cannot conceive biogeochemistry without a hydrological component. So this is where things, I think, are going. And then we saw a lot about landscape structure. Today we had some really interesting talks about this is exploring the structure of these networks in the landscape and the factors that generate structure in these. And I'm not going to go into there, but these are challenges. Of course, this is our reality. And our reality is the reality of complex, interconnected networks. And we have traditionally, many of us, worked on a lake, on lakes, or on small streams. We're quite disciplinary in that sense. Some of us tend to do large rivers. But it is becoming clear that our lake, our small stream, our small bog are just stations along this voyage of the carbon that starts in the soil and ends in the ocean. So I think what I seeing in our community is moving away from the individual system. The DOC is not Lake DOC anymore. A lake is just a stop in this DOC that is traveling in the landscape. It just occupies a small fraction of that dimension of residence time, exposure, age. And I think we are going towards a more integrative, or I think we should go into a more integrative approach, not just for carbon, but for organisms as well, for other species, for pollutants. I can feel B because I know that thing. I will leave you with an excellent example of Browning, and I will thank you all for your attention.
Do we have any questions for Paul? If you do, please come up to the microphones.
Hey, Paul. A couple of comments and then a question. First comment is that was really impressive to be able to basically take so many talks from this week and talk about their work intelligently. So you should feel good about that.
Here comes a bad one.
Yeah. The second one is, you know, it's been a long time since I've read the Bible, and I want to thank you for conducting a Bible lesson for me. It's not the way I remember it, but that's okay. But the third one is serious, and that is related to your topic, you know, too much carbon. And this is probably a question that we deal with as we drink the beer, but you know, in thinking about the talks that I heard this week and ASLO in general, one of the things that I sort of wonder about is, do we have too much of a focus on carbon in the work that we're doing? There's a lot more to aquatic systems than just carbon, obviously, and we saw some of that this week, but you know, clearly a lot of the sessions are dominated by understanding carbon and putting it into the context of the global carbon cycle. And you know, I'm all for that. I was involved with some of those papers, but I just wonder if we've gone too far.
Do you want a response?
Now you're supposed to tell me your sage wisdom.
You know, this goes in cycles, and we've had cycles of all kinds of things. Okay, we had ASLOs dominated by UV. We had ASLOs where viruses were all over. It goes in cycles, and it will probably have its own cycle. I think this is a confluence of having a small meeting where this has not been diluted by other things, and I think it represents the moment that the field is living. You know, we see every talk we do see the pipe, the reactor. Well, these things are repeated ad infinitum, okay? And it gets to a point where you say, well, let's not repeat this anymore. But I think we have to get over this hump of need to actually consolidate this, and I think it will get subdued and perhaps dispersed a bit with other things. For instance, I would have liked to have more microbial ecology with carbon, because this is what I like, and not just purely geochemistry. Yeah? Well, that will come. I think it's a phase. So I cannot judge whether there's too much carbon. I get tired of it, really. You get tired of going over the same things and so on. Although I thought that this week was actually I found it very interesting this week. So it wasn't heavy on me in particular. But it's a cycle, and it will, once we get over this moment, I think it will disperse a bit, I think.
Well, clearly we've made a lot of great progress, and that's important.
And I think this keeps a bit the momentum of this progress. And so in that sense, it's useful, because we are pounding on the same messages, because we are pounding on the same messages, and to a point where it becomes a bit repetitive and a bit boring. But I think some of them have to be pounded. We are at that stage, and then I think it will move on to some.
Hi, Paul. That was a great talk. So I'm wondering if you can sort of, in a slide or a sentence, briefly think about what would you be the message for the people who are on the salty side of the divide when you get to that 0.9 or whatever units of carbon it is that's going into the ocean. What should we take away from this meeting, from all the fresh water, that you would share with the people who are interested in the ocean side of the carbon cycle?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, it does matter what carbon the ocean gets. It does matter how much, but what carbon the ocean gets. So that has a practical implication. But I think there are other interesting things. Oceanographers are used to following masses of water and so on. And I think there are things that we can learn from each other. We have been very fragmented in the way we follow carbon because of our disciplinary philosophies of either doing lakes or this or the other. Oceanographers are used to following things in their travels. They follow currents and they follow. So we have things to learn from that, in the sense that you have to follow the history matters, and they know that the history matters, where it comes from, how long it took to get there, and so on. What I think that geochemists in the ocean don't have, they have a very geochemical perspective of DOC. And I think what they lack is a more biological perspective of integrating some of these processes that are at the focus of a lot of the freshwater research. And I think they lack a bit of this biological and microbial ecology, perhaps, aspect of it in terms of transformations and so on. So that could be something that perhaps could be transmitted. But I think there's stuff to be learned on both sides, no, of this equation.
Thank you.
Oh, wow, somebody coming from far away.
Is this on? Yeah. Paul, thank you for the talk. I have a question about the little giants. So I had the opportunity to do research in a Paramo system in Colombia, South America. And we were measuring PCO2 in a small wetland. It was very small, like maybe 10 meters long. And the PCO2 was close to 1,600 when the average in the planet is close to 400. So it seems to be very significant, the difference. But then, you know, what you were saying about the little giants is they are big in fluxes. And when we think about fluxes, well, it is the amount of mass over the amount of area and time. So if the flux is high, but the areal extent of these wetlands or beaver dam reservoirs is small, are they really giants, or do rivers overcome any of those numbers of fluxes being high in small wetlands?
Yeah, it's all a game. It's all a numbers game. But the point is that there are several points. You don't need a lot of this surface for it to have a very big impact. The second thing is that, we are revising, because we tend to think of the systems that we know, the back of our house and so on, but our understanding of the distribution of water in the biosphere is evolving all the time. And every time somebody comes up with a new estimate of how much freshwater surface there is and how is it distributed and so on, it changes. It tends to increase. So, and in particular, the small ecosystems are the ones that are the most uncertain, because all these little bogs, all these little rivers that are not well captured by remote sensing and so on, this is where we have the biggest uncertainty. And we have to think beyond the places that we know. We have to think in terms of the vast boreal and subarctic landscapes, the tropical areas that have these bogs that nobody has ever mapped. So there's a lot of small ecosystem that is distributed worldwide, which is not well understood in terms of occupancy and so on. And this is where I predict the biggest increases in our global fluxes will come from in the coming years. Because we know where the big lakes are, and we know where the big rivers are, and there are not many surprises in terms of fluxes from those ecosystems, okay? The surprises will come from the little giants.
Okay, I think we're going to stop it there. So I'll just say thank you, Paul, and I don't know about you guys, but, well, depends what sessions you attended, but I feel like I got double my money out of this conference now because I just got a summary of all the talks I didn't go to. So thank you. I think we should think about doing this for every meeting. Okay, so Tammy, do you want to say something?
Just thank you all for sticking around to the almost bitter end, and please join us out in the courtyard for enjoyment and libation. Thank you.